5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Hey, space enthusiasts. Many of you may already read Casey Handmer's blog. It's a blog that I personally love, which features many articles on space topics, including really cool ones like explaining misconceptions about Starship or how to terraform Mars. Now, we couldn't possibly do justice to the wealth of topics he's written about in one podcast episode, but we are taking somewhat of a whirlwind tour through some of his best-known posts on space. I think you'll really enjoy it.
My name is Raphael, and I'm an investor and advisor to space companies. Just as a reminder, this podcast is for informational purposes only, and nothing should be taken as investment advice. This podcast is sponsored by NanoAvionics, a satellite manufacturer and mission integrator. Their technologies enable many space companies worldwide to offer services that improve life right here on Earth, such as providing global connectivity, conducting Earth observation, or contributing to scientific discoveries. Check them out, and also check out my episode with the CEO and co-founder. Sadly, I am not a rocket scientist, but I'm an alumnus of the International Space University. ISU offers a number of educational programs about space worldwide. Check them out at isunet.edu.
And just some final things before we start the episode about ourselves. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platforms such as Apple or Spotify. If you want us help expand our work, you can do so and support us at www.patreon.com/Space Business Podcast, and we'll also put that link in the episode notes. And lastly, you can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. So welcome back to another episode of the Space Business Podcast. And as you longtime listeners know, despite us having the word business in the name of the podcast, every few episodes we bring somebody on who is not focused, or at least not exclusively focused, on the business side of space. So today I'm really excited about our guest. Even though he now does have a startup company too, Casey Handmer writes something called, Casey Handmer's blog, which regularly features in-depth articles on space topics. So, welcome, Casey.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, Casey, I think probably a lot of our listeners are already reading your blog. Do you just want to give us sort of the short description of what the blog is and why you decided to start one?
Sure. I mean, I've been writing blogs since high school on a whole variety of topics. But one of my long and enduring interests is space, and most of my blogs, at least in the past few years, have been on space-related topics. And I've always kind of struggled with how to approach the topic because I don't really know that much about it. And the reality is that humanity as a whole doesn't know that much about it. It's still an area of active kind of exploration and discovery. And so it's like really difficult to talk about this in a way that doesn't come across as like pretending you know something you don't know or something. But then I realized that actually the reason I was frustrated about this was because I just saw like discussions in media essentially that I felt were insufficiently accurate, and I thought, well, I can talk about that. And so I ended up finding this like terrific vein of blog fodder, which was essentially rounding up 20 or 30 more or less common misconceptions that kind of kept appearing as tropes in TV or movies or interviews or podcasts or articles or whatever, and going through and just kind of explaining why it is that this is misunderstood, and what are the key questions, and how can we think about this, and so on. And it was quite useful. At the time I was quite often getting into protracted discussions on Twitter, which is not really a very good forum for that. But I could always be like, well, I've written something about this. Here's the link. Let me know what you think. And the overall goal was just to kind of shift the Overton window of discussion and the standards of discussion on this particular topics into something that's a little bit more productive, a little more focused on actually like going and building something.
So keeping all of that in mind, what you just said, how would you characterize your target audience?
That's a good question. People have often asked me, why don't I monetize the blog somehow, put some ads in or something like that. The reality is I've always written for, an interested audience, not necessarily a particularly knowledgeable or technically literate one, but certainly an aspirational one. And I've always, and I've taken to heart when I've written stuff that's way too obscure and people that, misunderstand stuff, that I find out about that pretty quickly. But at the same time, I would say that primarily I'm writing for my own entertainment. And I think over time, I've managed to avoid audience capture by essentially just writing what I want to and how I like it. And sometimes I write blogs that get, straight on Hacker News and have hundreds of thousands of views straight away. And quite often I write blogs on like really weird esoteric stuff that, it takes me 6 months to research and write, and like 5 people read it. And even my mum lies that she's read it. So, it's, I just write whatever the hell I want. And sometimes people like it.
And so just expand on this a little bit. So what is there any sort of process of picking the topics? I mean, especially if they can take a few months to write. I mean, I assume there's some sort of thought process of like, okay, now I'm going to write about, getting power to the lunar base or something.
Okay, yeah. Well, so actually, the vast majority of them, of the blogs, and in particular the ones that have done quite well, were pretty spontaneous. So probably my two most famous blogs or most popular blogs were the back-to-back ones on Starlink and Starship, which I wrote just over 3 years ago. And at the time, I was working at JPL, which is a NASA center in Los Angeles, and so like this is something that I was discussing and thinking about and following closely in the news. But this aspect, which is like Starlink is a thing and Starship is a thing, and people don't really understand it, and even people at JPL, like in an institutional sense, the organization didn't seem to understand what was going on. And so I had all these ideas in my brain, and at the time I had one young child. Now I have 2 young children, but I had a free evening where they somehow went to bed at a reasonable hour, and I just sat down and on my old laptop and just like cranked out these blog posts two nights back to back. I think I even published them the same day, and then I like corrected the typographical errors the next day once they were already up, something like that. So the process is actually normally just like composition in white heat, which I actually prefer. But in terms of research and background research, sometimes you have to do a bit of calculation or a bit of simulation or something like that. So actually for the Powering the Lunar Base blog, there's 2 of those. The first one was kind of inspired by this idea, and at the time I was working on some lunar mapping stuff, so I had all the data handy. I was inspired by this idea that if you built how do I start this? Mars's rotational inclination is only about 5 degrees. Sorry, not Mars, Moon. The Moon's rotational inclination is at about 5 degrees, which is to say that even in winter, the pole of the Moon is not that far away from the sun. It's almost perfectly oriented with its orbital axis. So I thought, well, the Moon is kind of lumpy and bumpy, but maybe it's possible that you could build a power tower at the South Pole or the North Pole on the top of a tall mountain, and it would stick up far enough that it was always in the sun, and then you could avoid this really nasty problem, which is that the Moon has 14-day long, 300 something odd hour long nights.
Day night.
And even at the South Pole, it's still pretty damn long, and it's really hard to store energy for that period of time.
And very big temperature differences.
Yeah, the temperature differences are also considerable, but if you have enough energy, then you can solve that problem with heat pumps and air conditioning. So I thought you could put up a power tower. Anyway, so I basically ran the math on that. It turns out it's not a great idea. You need a tower. It's about 3 kilometers tall, because in the South Pole there's this big massif or mountain called Malapert, which is not far from the pole, but it kind of shades parts of the pole in winter and vice versa. So it's kind of the worst possible situation there. But I kind of looked at some other ways of powering things on the Moon, like nuclear power or other forms of sunlight independent power. And at the same time, I think I was revising an earlier blog on space-based solar power, which constantly comes up, and I realized that actually, like, by far the easiest way of getting power on the Moon is to beam it from the Earth in the form of microwaves. So like you take space-based solar power, but instead of beaming the energy from space down to the Earth, you beam it in the other direction, which I thought was cheeky enough that it was worth a blog post of its own, and it was actually a really fun one to write as well.
Did you get a lot of comments on that, since it was kind of cheeky?
To the extent that I wrote it seeking clicks and likes and attention, I don't know if it succeeded. I mean, I've met a handful of people who are knowledgeable in adjacent spaces, and I should say I have not been overwhelmed with agreement by other people, but that's okay. Part of the reason I write these things is to help us ferret out the ways and places in which we disagree. But in terms of the math, I'm confident that I got that correct. So anyone else can run the math. It's not that complicated to figure out what it looks like. And the thing that doesn't appeal to people about it is if you're using microwaves to power the lunar base, most of those microwaves are just like slamming into the lunar surface or going out into space and not doing anything, because you're only capturing a little bit here and there. And that seems really wasteful. You're like, oh well, energy is so precious on the Moon. Why should we waste it? But the reality is it's not wasteful, because you're shooting that energy up from the Earth, where it's like 1 million or 100 million times cheaper to make it. And so you can afford to throw away 999,999 parts in 1 million, because and still break even on cost. And the reality is that humanity emits energy essentially into space all the time anyway, just not in forms that are necessarily recoverable on the Moon.
And the reason there's so much wastage is because the microwaves spread out, or? Yeah.
So, I mean, in principle, it'd be possible to make a really focused beam of microwaves on the Moon that you could harness, but it would cost more. And at the end of the day, the only thing that really matters is like, what is the cost of power delivery? So you have to be really, really careful about how you do your calculation and not optimize too much for various ancillary parameters that just don't matter that much in the final analysis. So as an example, you could create a focused microwave beam at, let's say, at the microwave microwave receiver on a lunar base somewhere in the south pole of the moon. But in order to do that, you would need a significantly more advanced power transmission infrastructure. So instead of having, I think in my blog, I had like a discrete set of antennas, a couple of miles wide or something like that, dotted around the surface of the Earth, so that there would always be one facing, or a handful of them facing the moon, and then they can phase lock either with the help of a carrier beam from the moon, or with what's called open loop tracking. Basically, you do fancy calculations using GPS, and just to make sure they're not canceling each other out too badly. But in order to do like a focused beam, let's say 100 meters wide or something, you need like an antenna that's 1,000 kilometers wide or something, which is like the size of a continent. So in practice, that would be multiple smaller antennas all over the place, but they'd all have to be phase locked. And then because the moon librates and mutates and carries on in the sky, you need very sophisticated calculations and/or phase tracking to make sure that your beam didn't kind of miss. And at the end of the day, like the overall power density that you achieve on the surface of the moon is no better, right? At the end of the day, you don't want to do much more than a couple of hundred watts per square meter. And the total amount of infrastructure you have to build on the surface of the Earth and its complexity is orders of magnitude higher. So you're like, why are we bothering to do this? We could just use the same infrastructure and spray a whole bunch of power, all over the whole surface of that part of the moon. And then as long as people are working within sight of the Earth, which is, roughly half of the moon all the time and a little section of the moon some of the time, then you don't really even need batteries or additional motor power. So you can have a rover or a spacesuit just kind of charge itself as you walk around, as long as you're within sight of the Earth, which I think is sweet. Like that'd be amazing. Like imagine that. Imagine not having to dick around with like batteries and stuff on a rover.
Yeah. And just quickly, so in your idea, the power would actually literally come from Earth. It's not like one of the proposed like geostationary space-based solar power stations. It would come from Earth.
No, there's absolutely no reason to bother with space-based solar power to power the moon. I mean, that just makes the whole issue even worse. You'd be better off just putting solar panels on the moon and somehow dealing with the nighttime. Probably the second best way of dealing with that is to have really, really large thermal storage tanks. So for a smallish base, you could have exceptionally large underground lake or something that you freeze and then thaw over the course of the cycle to extract and then dump heat. But even then, and so the advantage of that is that the working fluid, the water, you could potentially locate or obtain on the moon. So you wouldn't have to send it up from Earth. Whereas if you're sending up batteries, that's obviously quite expensive in terms of, I mean, like you say, well, Starship makes things cheaper to send. But if you look at your overall power system, you ideally like, the solar panels would be more than like 0.1% of the total mass. And so, or the same goes for a nuclear power plant. So it's just some random ideas. Obviously there's inconveniences to being powered from the Earth. What if they decide to turn off all your power plants one day? That would be inconvenient. But at the end of the day, like we have forward operating bases all over the world that are in many ways no less vulnerable to supply chain interruptions, in Antarctica or whatever. So even though they generate their own power locally with diesel or whatever.
Yeah, in some way it would sort of, let's say, politically tidally lock the moon to the Earth too. Like it would be very hard for a independent colony like in Moon and a harsh mistress to emerge. If you have to,
I'll have a blog about that. That's a fun book. God, yes, Heinlein is so misunderstood. I mean, like, I don't necessarily see eye to eye with him on his politics, nor with Kim Stanley Robinson for that matter, which is fine. I mean, we're allowed to have different opinions. It seems to me that like the number of people who are excessively enthusiastic about Heinlein seem to miss the point an awful lot. But anyway, it's a fun book. It's actually a really, really fun book about AI alignment, actually. Like fundamentally, that's kind of what it comes down to. But yeah, there is this idea that you could have an independent moon colony fighting for its independence or something, and of course all these stories are just cribbed off the American Revolution.
You were mentioning Starship a minute ago. So coming back to Starship, so you said you wrote the Starship blog post a couple of years ago, and it was misunderstood. So it's been a couple of years. There have been some high altitude test flights. There has been a lot of blogging and reporting about Starship. Do you feel it's any better understood now, or that it's still misunderstood?
Yeah. So I wrote a follow up a year ago. So 2 years after the original blog called Starship is Still Not Understood.
Okay.
And then not long after that, I wrote one called Science Upside for Starship, which more or less lays out like how we could rethink, for example, like the various space exploration programs. We've got like planetary science, we've got astrophysics, earth science, and so on, in the context of using Starship for that. I would say that like Starship development is one of these things where like on a year-to-year basis, it seems slower than you'd expect, but over the course of a decade, a lot more occurs than you would have expected. So like basically humans are bad at exponentials. But I would say that with the notable exception of the Human Landing System contract, which is NASA's contract to develop the lunar lander for humans under the Artemis program, which was given to Starship, there doesn't seem to be a lot of, as I say, like at the institutional level, people understanding and digesting what the implications of Starship would be. Certainly individual engineers and program managers and stuff get it. And some of them read my blog, but many of them understood it well before I even talked about it with them. But what I care about is like if you see NASA, for example, as some sort of meta-organism that is it's also in some ways an AI alignment problem, because all its different components, all the different bureaucrats and so on who work at NASA are essentially following local rules that are not set by them to execute their jobs. Their expectations and their roles are fairly well defined. That organization as a whole, like all bureaucratic organizations, is not particularly good at assimilating new information. As a result, we have this kind of issue where missions are still being developed according to a set of assumptions that are no longer valid, and actually have not been valid since Falcon 9 started flying, but will be sure as hell extremely unvalid as soon as Starship is flying, which is sad, right? Because at the end of the day, what this comes down to is capital misallocation. Yeah. Capital being, essentially money and the time of and expertise of people involved, spending an awful lot of time and effort solving problems that no longer exist, while failing to take advantage of new opportunities to solve previously unsolvable problems. And we kind of run up against the fundamental frustration, which is that human life is finite, and we would like to see more exploration occur before we die of old age. For some of these larger projects, there is a really good chance that I will not live to see the successor to JWST. So, it's like, let's get on with it. The thing that really galls me about this, and that I've only really understood recently, is that for so much of what we're dealing with, as a society, but also in space exploration, it's not like the difficulties that we face are artificial. Obviously, like exploring space is technically difficult, but we've made it way more difficult than it has to be. For example, what fraction of people's income in the United States is spent on housing? Housing is a solved problem. We've known how to build houses for 10,000 years. Like, that's not controversial. But yet for some reason we've decided as a culture that we should make housing deflationary and really scarce and really expensive, which means that some huge fraction of our GDP gets shoveled into essentially a speculative asset that doesn't actually produce any wealth. This is just awe-inspiringly stupid. And the same sort of things occur in space exploration, where we've essentially erected a whole series of artificial barriers and roadblocks that make it a lot more difficult than it has to be. And space is hard enough as it is. So this is kind of the underlying frustration coming up. But I think the way that we deal with that is we write blogs with kind of a constructive tone of thinking that helps to explain to people how they can think about these problems in a more expansive or open-ended way.
Yeah, and I mean, we could open a rabbit hole here, but I mean that's probably not only space exploration and housing. I mean, I'd argue probably in many countries education is also not optimized. There's probably probably society at large. Sometimes you'd think that it would be good to have sort of the Heinlein type AI who could help out a little bit, but I mean, we'll see how that works in the future or not.
AI will save us, possibly, but I don't think so. So we'll see.
Let's talk a little bit. So one thing you've been writing a lot about in various blogs is basically taking humanity off Earth, right? Whether it's to the moon or Mars, and what we need to do to make that happen. Whether it's energy generation, which we just talked about in the context of the moon, or other things. So I just want to kind of basically use that as sort of an overarching topic, if you don't mind. And let's talk about basically getting humanity to Mars, and not in a flags and footprints manner, as they say, but basically establishing a permanent presence there, as people like Elon have in mind. And if we want to do that, obviously that requires a whole sort of stack of technologies. I think you've touched probably on almost all of them in one or the other blog post. So we need a transport capability, talk about Starship. You need energy generation, which you just talked about. You need habitats. You need greenhouses to grow food. You need other forms of life support. You may need robotics to basically make things happen in a very hostile environment. You may need surface transport. This is probably a whole bunch of things I'm not even thinking about. Sort of, which ones of these elements do you think are most important, and also which ones maybe yet again the most misunderstood?
I mean, the hardest part of the overall system by far is transporting humans from Mars back to Earth. This is actually the title of the first book that I wrote about space stuff when I was just getting started back in about 2015 or thereabouts, which is like how to get to Earth from Mars, solving the hard part first. Relatively speaking, I think getting from Earth to Mars is also quite difficult, but nowhere near as difficult as getting from Mars back to Earth. And then once on Mars, day-to-day survival is primarily a problem of logistics. And if logistic capacity, particularly with, say, one-way cargo transport is sufficient, then actually living on the surface of Mars, I don't see as being dramatically more difficult than, say, living in Antarctica or some other, quite hostile, living in a nuclear submarine or something, like essentially a hostile environment with a highly technological machine that protects the humans inside. But getting from Mars back to Earth is really fiendishly difficult. So that's when it comes down to it, I think Starship is the key piece of the puzzle, because that's I don't know, like you can read through the Wikipedia article on like various proposed architectures for exploring Mars, and essentially none of them actually solve the getting humans back problem, quote unquote, well enough. Some of them, make a solid stab at it, but at the end of the day, in my view, they place a lot of what I call marginal requirements on the design that are essentially impose exponential cost penalties for linear cost savings, and as a result, like they can't work. Whereas Starship understands that, like the Starship architecture understands that this is the hard part. We need to design a rocket that can do this one part and then build the rest of the architecture around that. And so you don't end up with like some arbitrary constraint like, oh, well, everything has to be able to fit in the shuttle payload bay, or everything has to use, certain kinds of fuel, or we have to necessarily restrict the crew size because we have no way of getting a crew of more than 1 or 2 people off Mars and then into orbit and then back to Earth or something. And I think it's just really important to understand that Starship is built to be able to transport many tens of tons of stuff from Mars directly back to Earth in a single stage, which is actually not even technically all that difficult because the delta V required is relatively low. It's certainly much easier than, say, from Earth directly to Mars without refueling in low Earth orbit. But yeah, when you say, okay, we need to solve this problem, then naturally you end up with a very, very large rocket with a very high efficient engine and really strong commitment to good mass fraction and stuff like that. So you end up with Starship, which is just a giant rocket. I'd say that the next hardest part for the whole system is actually what's called entry, descent, and landing on Mars. Mars's atmosphere is thick enough to help a little bit, which means one doesn't have to carry all the fuel out to Mars necessary to slow down. You can use the atmosphere to slow you down most of the way, but it's also really thin by Earth standards. So for a large enough spaceship to fly home, for example, like the Starship, there's a real risk that it'd be heavy enough on entry that it wouldn't slow down in the atmosphere before it hit the ground. And so that's obviously a problem. So you need to have some sort of entry, descent, and landing system that is capable of generating quite a bit more lift than a blunt body system, like the capsules that the rovers landed in, and you need obviously some sort of control system, and then as Starship does, the ability to backflip and then use its engines to land in a pinpoint precision location. All of which is we now know not technically impossible, but none of which had really been seriously considered in either Constellation or Mars Direct or any of the other more or less comprehensive paper studies that would have been done previously.
So I have to ask you, because you started out saying sort of the hardest part is getting back to Earth from Mars.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, so this may sound extreme, but if we really want to settle another place besides Earth and we want committed settlers, like why do we actually care about that? I mean, I could say sort of in the olden days, when people emigrated from, say, Europe to what today is the US or Argentina or Australia, they basically went on a one-way ticket, right? Why should it be any different for the solar system?
Yeah, I used to subscribe to that general feeling, which is like, well, our ancestors had it rough and they made it. I think that our culture has obviously changed in the intervening times, and mostly for the good. But I would say that while it is likely in the case that you are building a city that most people would immigrate permanently, particularly because there'd be a really steep cost penalty to have to come back, you should still have that technical capability to send stuff back, right? So and particularly in the exploration phase, I think the first time people go, you would want to be able to return. And even if you end up in a situation that, say, only 1% of the people there ever come back to Earth, that's still a necessary thing. I think it's important to remember that our ancestors who shrugged off the death of most of their children, et cetera, probably had, like, by our modern standards, really shit lives. And we shouldn't be like, well, all we have to do is desire to live in a world where some trivial infection could kill you and most of your children will not see adulthood and you have no political rights, as like the sort of expansive future we want to build for humanity. But I do certainly think so. Like, my views on this have evolved in that I used to think that it would, especially before SpaceX moved to stainless steel, that it would be a good idea to fly all the rockets back to Earth to reuse them. But my understanding now is that the marginal cost of Starships are low enough that you could probably afford to send them one way, and you may want to like salvage pieces of them and send those pieces back to Earth later potentially. But if you think about it, like, I need another Starship, is it easier to take a slightly worn out Starship that's on the surface of Mars, or is it easier to take your factory that's already producing 1,000 Starships a year and make one additional Starship? And I think the answer to that is that it's easier just to make more Starships. And so the nice thing about doing that is that it means that the overall fraction of the base's economic capacity, which is devoted to synthetic fuel production, can be greatly reduced if you're sending all the cargo Starships essentially one way. You don't have to worry about margins for return. You don't have to worry about anything like that. So yeah, that's a that's a nice one.
And I assume even if the starships go one way only, right? I mean, it's not like they're completely lost. I assume we could use the stainless steel on Mars for something.
Well, yeah. So it's an interesting point. I think it would be quite possible to, for example, employ the volume inside. I have a blog about this in the context of lunar bases, but essentially it's like 1,000 or 2,000 cubic meters of pressurizable volume inside the Starship. So you could essentially repurpose them as pressurized skyscrapers, maybe either for storage of certain gases or even for people who live in them. I strongly suspect that there'll be much nicer places to live on Mars, maybe not on the moon, but on Mars than inside a Starship after it has arrived. But yeah, I mean, certainly as a source of raw materials, not bad. 100 tons of stainless steel lying around would certainly find its uses. No, but the key thing is, like, in order to send a Starship back to Earth, you need to make about 1,200 tons of propellant, and that's a lot. I mean, I founded a company. I'm literally sitting in the office right now, and what we are doing is synthetic hydrocarbon, synthetic methane production. So it's literally the same chemical process that you would need to make fuel on Mars, with a few tweaks on here to make it a bit easier for us on Earth. But just like, I can't even remember. Like, I think we make a couple of hundred kilograms per unit per day or something. So to make 1,200 tons, over the course of a year, you'd need, like, I don't know, 100 megawatts or so of power, which is just a staggering amount of power to think about in the context of a base of, like, 100 people or 1,000 people. So, essentially, in order to do that at scale, you would need to send many Starships worth of materials and equipment and nuclear reactors and stuff in order to get that done. And if you are able to delete that requirement from the critical path, then obviously all that capacity, logistic capacity, and also institutional or, like, organizational capacity on the surface can be devoted towards other things that are more important. So I think overall, like, sending most of the Starships one way is probably the way to go.
And so, considering that considerable capacity that Starships have, so with refueling sort of 100 metric tons plus, how should we use that capacity, you think? I mean, besides bringing humans, right? What should we bring, sort of keeping in mind what is available that we know of on Mars?
Yeah, I have a blog post on this as well, which is called the make-buy question, or understanding the make-buy question on Mars. Essentially, it's like understanding, like, what do you make and what do you bring with you? It's actually, there's some very interesting and subtle stuff that goes on here, because obviously initially you have to bring everything, and as a rough rule of thumb, like 10 tons of gear for every 1 ton of human or something like that, just to keep them alive. And then over time, the components of, like, if you break down, like, the per capita allocation of stuff, most of it will be what we call dumb mass, which is like heavy stuff that's not too complicated, and some of it is smart mass, which is like not so heavy stuff that's really complicated and hard to make. And so over time, it gives you a pretty straightforward list of things that you want to produce locally, and by far the major contributions are, like, gases. I mean, let's start at the beginning. Water, obviously. We need more water than anything else, and we'd better damn well find a source of it on Mars quickly, or we'll be in trouble. Obviously rocks, undifferentiated rocks and dirt and stuff. Gases, maybe methane and primitive plastics and stuff like that. And then in the second tier you start to get at, like, making metals and things. And then in the third tier you can do, like, highly manufactured goods. The thing is, like, over time, obviously, that the base is growing. Its local industrial capacity and ability to manufacture things is improving, which would see, like, a trend towards gradually onshoring production rather than importing stuff from Earth. But at the same time, we should also expect to see that, like, the cost of shipping stuff via Starship would decrease as well, which would in turn incentivize moving stuff from importing more stuff from Earth. So it'll be interesting to see, like, which of these two trends grows more quickly, and which of them eventually reaches some threshold or like upper limit, which then allows the other one to prevail. It's not entirely clear from first principles, which one will prevail outside of, knocking down the first 90% of mass. But I think the key thing is, like, each human needs a couple of 100 kilograms of stuff just to survive the trip from Earth. And so if they need a couple of 100 kilograms of additional stuff in order to survive on Mars for the rest of their life, that's not a huge marginal increase in the total cargo required to ship to Mars. And so if you wanted to ship more people, maybe the easiest thing to do is to make more Starships rather than to try and find ways of, I don't know, mass producing flash memory or something on the surface of Mars. Like the relative difficulty of doing that versus the benefit of doing that is really low. So yeah, I mean, like, you could plausibly import a lifetime supply of like computer chips when you come to Mars, like tucked in amongst your underwear. And so there might be, like, ideological reasons for knowing how to make at least some computer chips, like basic
Mars sovereignty
locally. Yeah, like Mars sovereignty or, like, autarky. It's probably a good idea to at least have some capacity there. But at the same time, like, I do not seriously think that like, TSMC Arcadia Planitia will compete with TSMC Taiwan anytime soon.
Yeah.
Let's be sensible here. But I think you can kind of break down per capita consumption. I mean, if I can pull up that chart probably, can have a quick look at some exact numbers. People often underestimate just how much water people consume, and it's and I don't think it's a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing that people consume a lot of water. To be clear, I think that water is cheap and it should be cheap. And we should have a lot of it and be able to use it. All right, let's have a look. All right, so I'm looking at a chart that you can find in the Make Buy Question blog, and essentially here I estimate the annual consumption in kilograms per capita and the annual cost in dollars per capita of a whole bunch of different things, both in terms of Earth baseline cost, the cost it would cost to the amount it would cost to import them from Earth, and then the amount it would cost to produce them on Mars, and that gives you a way to compare these three costs and decide which is best. But for example, on Earth, annual consumption of water on Earth is about 1,000 tons, which sounds like a lot, but like that's obviously not just for flushing toilets. That's also for agriculture that supports you. But the cost, the amount of money that we spend on water is at least a couple $100 per capita per year. So like it's less than $1 per ton, which is staggering, because like right now the cost of launching stuff to space is around $2,000 a kilogram, so $2 million a ton. And obviously getting stuff on Mars would be at least a 10x, if not 100x on top of that. So $200 million a ton, depending on, I think Starship says that they might be able to hit $100 a ton of stuff to Mars or something. I'll say $100 a ton. Well, it's still more than 100 times more expensive than water on Earth. So like that's a lot of money. All right, we've got methane, rubble, oxygen, concrete, nitrogen, steel, basic carbs, and in the intermediate phase, which is the stuff where you're like not quite sure if import will win against local manufacture. We've got things like fasteners, plastics, fertilizers, nitrogen, textiles and clothing, copper, aluminium, and some basic machinery. And then in the realm of stuff where per capita consumption is on the order of 1 gram per year, and the cost is obviously like the amount that people spend on it is also proportionally lower. Is obviously like proportionally lower, but it's still like the dollars per gram or something is extremely high. We've got essentially pharmaceuticals, highly processed food, like luxury food items, computer components, and precious metals, and certain drugs. So I just think it's kind of neat. Good. You can throw this stuff up on a graph.
We'll link to your blog obviously in the episode notes. I highly encourage people to read up on that, and your other blog posts. But so the good news so far is that all of the things we talked about, whether it's on transportation or various things we need for life support for Mars, I think technologically we have it more or less solved. Is there anything that you see that is still putting as a potential constraint on plans like establishing a self-sustaining city on Mars within a few decades time frame?
Well, the short answer is yes. I should say that like the technology that we would need to keep humans alive on Mars indefinitely is like it's understood. There are engineers who can build it, etc. But I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as solved. I would say that with a reasonably estimable investment of a finite sum of time and money, we should be able to get to like version 1 of a system that can do that. But version 1 is not going to be very good. That's going to be like the 1200s ocean-going ships or something like that, or like very early muskets or something. It's like it's not exactly like the super advanced version that actually makes sense and will work well. But it's better than nothing. But yes, in terms of that, no, there's still a lot of missing pieces, and it's all downstream of transport, which is why I think it makes sense for SpaceX to focus on getting the rocket right for now. But I do have a blog post on this, which I'll pull up because I cannot rely on memory, which is the opportunities for space companies, which I actually ended up following when I founded this company here. But essentially, large-scale solar arrays, air miners, water miners, rock miners, fuel plant, which is what we're doing here, life support, machinery, heavy machinery, telerobotics, pressure structures such as pressure tents, and then surface activity suits. And all these things are, in my view, unsolved or like incompletely solved, in the sense that we can speculate and we can draw pictures and we can make renderings and we know vaguely what they'll look like. But if you said, okay, right now I want to go out and spend $5 million and buy myself a spacesuit that will allow humans to work on the surface of Mars for extended periods of time, every day, no questions asked, you could not do it. And we don't want to spend $5 million on a suit. We'd rather spend $5,000 on a suit. Sure. But they just don't exist. And so it is my hope that people read this blog and go and found companies in these spaces that are able to make money within established markets, but also able to deliver value across the board.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about another aspect of sort of establishing humanity on Earth that you've also written about, which is the terraforming aspect. And that's, of course, we could probably spend like a sort of 3-hour episode just on that, of course.
Yeah,
but sort of at least scratching the surface a little bit. Sort of, how do you think about terraforming Mars? Do you think it is feasible? Are there misconceptions about it? Because obviously, this is being talked about a reasonable amount, and SpaceX has famously has the Nuke Mars T-shirts, which I have one in my closet.
Yeah, I think nuclear power is certainly something that's necessary on Mars, just to get things done long term. I don't think it's necessarily on the critical path, but terraforming is a fun one. It's not necessary in the short term. The reality is that humans can live on Mars, I think, quite comfortably and well without terraforming the planet. But I think it'll be irresistible longer term to do it. I think that a terraform Mars would be the most beautiful thing that humans have ever made. And I think that humans are unable to resist that kind of beauty. So it'd be very exciting to do it. There are, I think, 5 or 6 different ways of approaching the problem, and they all basically are terrible in their own ways. But I'd say that the 2 most promising ways are build a lot of greenhouse gas factories on the surface of Mars, which is obviously a lot easier to do if you already have like lots of factories on the surface of Mars, lots of cities and things. And then the second best way is, the best overall way, I think, is via solar sails. So like effectively increase the size of the sun on the surface of Mars by having a whole bunch of mirrors sitting out in space, reflecting light back towards the planet. Mm-hmm. And I wrote a blog on this fairly recently, actually, where I ran the numbers on it. And the neat thing about it is that you could do this with currently available technology, like off the shelf. Say 95% of it would be off the shelf. It's primarily like a systems integration and manufacturing problem. You could launch it with currently existing rockets, and you could begin the process of heating Mars up today. You do not have to get on the surface. You do not need humans involved. You don't need any new technology. You just need the will to build 100 million or 1 billion solar sails, which are roughly the same cost and form factor as a mobile phone, and to launch them and let them go and hang out around Mars and do their job, which I think is actually super compelling. In terms of so again, like it comes down to dollars, right? So like at the end of the day, Mars needs more heat. Heat is measured in watts. Mm-hmm. What is the greatest number of watts you can get on the surface of Mars per dollar? And when you run these numbers, just as you can with delivering electrical power to the moon, the cheapest way to do it is to absolutely minimize the amount of infrastructure you need on the surface of Mars. And so in the case of the moon, the best way to do it is to keep all the power generation stuff and transmission stuff on the Earth and just have a receiver antenna on the surface of the moon that can absorb the power and turn it directly into electricity. It's even simpler than a solar array. And in the case of Mars, you can terraform it without even touching the planet.
I don't remember all the details of that particular blog post now. Have you run sort of like ever overall numbers? Like, if you wanted to have a meaningful impact in terms of warming up Mars, like how much money are we talking about here? Sort of like, hundreds of billions, trillions, also to kind of then make a judgment as to how this could actually be executed in the real world. Like, for example, is that something that a nation by itself could do? Would it require several nations to work together, or is it actually small enough that it could be a public-private partnership? Those kinds of questions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the major obstacle to doing it would have to be a nation state, I think, in order to avoid people complaining too much. The blog post is called "How to Terraform Mars for $10 billion in 10 years." And to be clear, the end state of this process is not the planet actually being terraformed, which is like the shiftiest thing that I wrote here. The end state is the planet is warm enough to have liquid water on its surface. So it as opposed to, right now, it's like basically cold, dry, and vacuum. And with solar sails, you could get it to warm, wet, and poisonous atmosphere. So in some ways, it would be a little more hospitable than scuba diving, but quite a bit less hospitable than walking around on the surface of the Earth, unless you're inside, I don't know, some like volcano or something where you have to wear a gas mask. Yeah, basically, I just kind of run the math on like how many mirrors you would need and how long it would take you to build them, and you can make fairly unrealistic estimations here. So the key thing there is the idea is that if you heat Mars enough, particularly in certain locations, you can release enough CO2 that's currently frozen on the surface of the planet to warm the planet up. We know that this has happened historically on Mars at least hundreds of times. Probably as a result of asteroid impact, causing the atmosphere to thicken up and the planet to heat. But what we know for sure is that most of the time Mars has been cold and dry in the last 3 or 4 billion years, which means that the climate there has like 2 stable equilibria, one being warm and wet and one being cold and dry. And the warm and wet equilibria eventually decays over probably the order of 10,000 or 100,000 years and freezes out. And there's a very, very clever researcher who at least was at Harvard last time I checked, called Robin Wordsworth, who's run a bunch of simulations on this stuff. And his best guess, at least according to papers I read on this a while ago, was that because Mars has exceptionally high altitude, like say an exceptionally large area of its surface is at exceptionally high altitude, it is quite likely that if you had an active water cycle, you would get a kind of glaciation, like mass glaciation occurring on Tharsis, which is an equatorial area. So until recently, there were glaciers on Mount Kilimanjaro, which is effectively on the equator of the Earth, which is pretty amazing. And the Earth itself actually went through several snowball phases in the distant past, where it also got very icy and mass glaciation, and as a result, all that snow reflected a lot of heat from the sun and caused the planet to get colder and colder. But a similar sort of process probably occurs on Mars, where there's only ever a fairly limited quantity of water, and that water eventually all snows out on top of the mountains and forms giant glaciers up there, which then lock up the water for tens of thousands of years and effectively freeze out the water cycle, and then the amount of moisture in the atmosphere, which is an important greenhouse gas, drops off. And then in addition, you've got this entire high altitude area covered in glaciers, which are reflecting light back into space and reflecting heat back into space. And then the planet cools off, and then over time, either that the high altitude glaciers get buried by dust, or they sublimate and the water either evaporates and escapes into space, or it's kind of what's called saltates, where the water vapor molecules kind of bounce their way along the surface and eventually accumulate at the poles. It's uncertain exactly how much water is available on Mars, but in any case, kind of a downer as far as terraforming goes. That said, if we're able to sit on the surface and pump out adequate quantities of greenhouse gases to keep the planet warm, or launch enough solar sails to heat the planet up in the first place, then we can overcome that.
So that's since we're running short on time, let's shift towards some softer factors, sort of more societal stuff. I mean, have you thought about sort of, when we want to convince people to go to Mars and establish human presence there? I mean, besides the people that you have who are just going to, be very enthusiastic no matter what, sort of like, what do you think might be sort of the key attraction, or sort of a killer app, or how can we kind of, make sure that a society evolves that is just more than, the basis we have in Antarctica, for example?
That's actually an interesting question on two fronts. I think Antarctica actually has a fascinating and insular culture of its own, as do, the submarine service, for example. That's actually pretty opaque to outsiders, and I certainly think that you would see similar things occurring on Mars. In terms of who goes, essentially you're looking for the overlap of people who want to go with the overlap of people who have the skills and mindset necessary to survive. And it seems to me that this is not a difficult problem to solve. NASA has never been underwhelmed for applicants for its astronaut program. Yeah, and while it's possible that maybe only 0.1% of humanity would be cut out to move to Mars in the early days and build stuff and know what they're doing and have the financial resources and privilege necessary to get there, that's still many millions of people. So yeah, I think overall that's not a major constraint, just in terms of recruiting. What could even argue?
It comes back to your point from before, right, where you said that that does depend arguably on the return capability, right? Because of course the whole point with NASA is that even if you went with Apollo to the moon, you presumably knew that you had a way back, right? Whereas with Mars,
I mean, the astronauts knew they had about a 1 in 6 chance of not being able to come back, right? So like pretty good. But then again, like the odds, if you're a fighter pilot in the Second World War, for example, your odds of surviving were about 1 in 9 in 10 or something like that. So like if you flew 10 sorties, it was starting to look pretty grim. And ultimately, one of the things that really harmed the Luftwaffe's ability to fight was that they killed off all the pilots who knew what they were doing, because they never allowed them to retire. So yeah, I think it's probably. Yeah, it's nice to have for people to potentially be able to come back, but at the same time, like there essentially isn't a shortage of people right now who line up to do things recreationally that have very high consequences. I happen to know many people who enjoy rock climbing, for example, which is actually a sport that's pretty safe if you do it right. But if something goes wrong, it's pretty quick. And then obviously, like the armed forces are full of people who have signed up to essentially be put in harm's way by the state. We don't have to dwell too much on what's going on in Ukraine right now, but like I think everyone involved in that conflict knows what the stakes are. So personally, I don't have a great degree of interest. It's again, I'm privileged in this sense, but I don't have a great degree of interest in fighting other humans. But I could certainly, there's always a trade-off to be made between like the risk of a particular endeavor and potential reward or outcome. And I've always seen myself as someone who would be personally, happy to go and try different things like that. And I've always been interested in, approaching environments that are quite hostile and figuring out how to make them safe enough to deal with. I don't know if my calculus will change as I get older, but certainly when I was younger, I used to climb erupting volcanoes and things. So it's a fun exercise. Kind of figure out what goes on. So yeah, I don't think there's any shortage of humans who would be willing to do that.
So, but if you think about sort of humans who then really want to stay there for the long term and not come back, right? So if you want to create a real human society with everything that humans like to do, and then of course it involves also things like arts and sports and whatnot, but let's not even go into that. So one remaining questions I always have is that maybe the most quintessential activity that us humans engage in is creating and raising families. And I don't know whether you have looked at this or thought about this, but whenever I try looking, it feels like we have not really done a whole lot of research on having kids in non 1G conditions.
Yeah, it's certainly true. Yeah, I don't think you could justifiably accuse any of the space agencies of overinvesting in different gravity research. I don't worry about that too much. I have a blog on this as well, which is called Let's Make Space Babies or something. Actually, on Earth, it's kind of interesting amongst my peer group at least, and it's probably more the case in Europe than in the United States. But actually, as a species, we seem to be getting out of the habit of having families, which is kind of a worry. In the sense that I'd say in most of the developed world for the last 50 years, we have continued to make new humans primarily by preventing humans from dying rather than by actually making new humans, which is obviously not a bad thing. But at the same time, we need to be asking ourselves serious questions about who the hell is going to look after us when we're old, because most people are not having enough children to replace themselves, and the ones who are not having enough to replace the ones who aren't. This is an area of kind of sociological interest. It is quite possible that on the Martian frontier, people would do something about that. Well, first of all, I'd say that a self-sustaining civilization on Mars would almost certainly import people for a long time. If you look at that make-buy question, it's almost certainly easier to import fully trained adult humans from Earth than to make and raise humans on Mars. That said, children. I have a couple of young children myself.
Yeah. Okay, but that solves the sort of let's call it the workforce issue. It doesn't solve the human motivation. I want to have a family type issue.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, so not everyone can have children, but actually, historically speaking, probably only 40% of men had children at all. But I think some people wonder if it's fair on children to bring them into a strange world. My experience is that children are incredibly adaptable. I sometimes worry how are my children going to cope if we go on some long road trip? And the reality is they actually love it. They cope much better than us adults do. And the other thing is it's important to remember that if you're a child, you look around, you see adults, and you're looking for where your place in the society will be when you grow up. And in mature societies where, in parts of Switzerland, for example, I'm sure the median age is well over 50, the few children that do exist look around and they say, this is a society of managed decline. This is a society where all the good spots are already taken. All the wealth is taken. They're not building anything anymore. There's nothing for my generation to engineer or do. All those problems are solved. All the solvable problems are solved, and the unsolved problems no one has any will to fix, which is actually pretty freaking depressing. And I think if you look into reasons for the decline of the welfare and mental health in teenagers today, you wouldn't have to scratch the surface far to find that essentially it's this question of what is there for our generation to do that we are allowed to do. We're not allowed out of the sight of our parents until we're 18 kind of bullshit. In contrast to that, you say, well, a human raised on Mars would have potentially certain health consequences, risk of exposure. I think they're on the balance less risky than having our schools all next to freeways, as they frequently are in Los Angeles in terms of overall health risk. But certainly there's some potential consequences there in terms of radiation and gravity. But a child being raised in a Mars city would understand responsibility. They would understand their role in the society. They would be looking at a limitless frontier and a horizon and a world that desperately needs them and has a place for them. And essentially the only limit to what they can achieve is their own ambition. And that I think is a wonderful thing. I certainly felt that way growing up in Australia. Credit to my parents and the culture that they raised me in. But I felt that there was, in the 1990s at least, there was still a future worth building. Yeah, and I kind of I hope that we can provide that for our children. I think that would not be a bad thing. Certainly, you can look into studies of humans raised in various cultures with varying levels of material deprivation, I guess. Children are raised in Antarctica, for example. The Argentinians have bases on the Antarctic Peninsula where children are raised. So you could always look into those. But in my experience, at least, kids are freaking resilient, especially in the face of kind of existential struggles that they feel like they can actually help with. So in some ways I envy the children who would get raised on a Moon or Mars base and would get to, like, essentially from birth solve all the problems that many of us have spent our entire lives trying to imagine what it would be like to solve.
Yeah, I love this notion, because it kind of, it's also something we've seen in Earth's history, right? I mean, you mentioned you being from Australia, right? But Australia, like, the US, right, where people kind of left hard circumstances to sometimes arguably find even harder circumstances, at least at the beginning, but made things work and created really, really thriving cultures and societies, right? Where, one could make the argument, I mean, maybe that is likely, if we develop a society on Mars, maybe that is the likely thing to happen, because you would have some probably self-selection to start with in terms of the people who are actually willing to go there. And then you have the same effect, like, as these societies develop, right? Which is, I always sort of half jokingly say, this is why I'm sure you're probably watching The Expanse as well, right? The TV series. In The Expanse, Mars, the Mars Republic is portrayed as I think it's fair to say, far advanced society compared to Earth technologically and otherwise. And it kind of always made intuitive sense to me that would happen.
Yeah, I certainly think that, like, the frontier and technical challenges would spur substantial innovation. It's not to say that you couldn't do it on Earth if you did it the right way as well. I would state, though, that, like, if I look into my own ancestry in Australia, it took we burned 3 generations. Like, my family burned 3 generations before they were able to be prosperous. Which is, I know, it's kind of daunting to think about the fact that, the first generation that came out, they worked hard, they died in pain, alone, mental illness, addiction, suffering. Many of their children died. The ones that survived, like the 1 or 2 that survived, themselves had extremely difficult lives, although they weren't necessarily hungry for extended periods of time. And for them at least, most of their children survived to adulthood. So, like, that's a definite win. And then those children, they grew up, they had extremely hard physical labor oriented lives, but they were able to provide for their families. And then their children were able to get educated and fly in planes and things. So that's my grandparents. So, like, ideally we would be able to avoid that. And actually, I think just in general, actually, the analogy, like, this sort of analogizing breaks down when we think about Mars, because there isn't really a mode or a case there where you could have a situation where like the only way to survive would be hard physical labor. Like, if essentially in a situation that is that hostile, you're either winning, like, easily, or you're dead. If that makes any sense. Like, you're either doing extremely well or you're dead. So I don't think that analogy extends too far. But I certainly think that ultimately children will be born and raised in situations that we would see as quite foreign today. And actually, if you talk to my grandparents or whatever about the way they were raised and the way that my children are raised and so on, it's almost completely different as well. Just in a few short generations, we've completely changed our outlook on how humans approach freedom, but also, exposure to physical violence. I was just reading a memoir the other day of a man who grew up in Britain in the 1920s and was sent to boarding school and just, like, routinely beaten by all the masters and the nurse, all the senior boys, and so on. And it's just like, that was just something that people took for granted. And nowadays, I think in most Western cultures, at least, it's kind of, beating children is not seen as socially acceptable, let alone recommended, let alone normal. So definitely advances occurring left and right. Yes, exactly. Yes.
So I mentioned The Expanse, and so we touched upon basically sci-fi, which is traditionally always the last question on these podcast episodes. So typically I ask people for their favorite sci-fi works, and I will do that in a second with you as well. But since we've been talking about Mars so far, let me ask you first this question on sci-fi. I assume you know all of you definitely know the Mars trilogy, Kim Stanley Robinson, because your latest blog post is about that. We just talked about The Expanse, and then let me throw in as a third option, and I hope you've seen it as well, the original Total Recall movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger. So all 3 of those basically depict.
But yeah.
Okay. So let me ask you the other way around.
I think I've seen the newer one.
I was going to ask basically, that's terrible. No, the new one is terrible. The original is really good.
Okay.
I was going to ask you, like, all 3 of those basically depict, not even settlements, actually, like, Mars societies, colonies, to use a controversial term in some way. Let me ask you this way then, like, which of the sci-fi depictions of Mars do you like the most, and why?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the authors have created a literary backdrop for exploring ideas that, in some cases, they make a real effort to make it scientifically accurate. So, like Andy Weir's book, The Martian, for example. And I really enjoy that, because I read it and I can see the effort that went into making this something that could actually occur. In order to have a story, obviously aspects of it are somewhat contrived. And then, you can look at the skill of a really deeply talented writer like Kim Stanley Robinson, who is, by his own admission, not technical, but is able to kind of elide the technical difficulty and just kind of deal with it, allow the reader to kind of fill in the detail to the extent of their knowledge. And actually, that's like the key. Like, no one really wants to pick up a science fiction book that's a manual for how something might occur, like speculative stuff. They just want the story to, the story is ultimately about how people deal with, usually one or two changes in terms of their environment. Like this world, but what if X was true? So I really appreciate that. I would desperately, dearly love to read a book set on Mars by Neil Stephenson. I think Neil Stephenson's also an absolutely brilliant writer, and actually in many ways extremely technical as well. Certainly accomplished in terms of physics and coding and calculation, which I think leaps off the pages of his books. But we have to wait for that one. But if you're listening, Neil, thank you, please. And then I read a whole bunch of the like more vintage ones, like the Princess of Mars ones and the Burroughs books and so on, and they obviously predate any of the robotic missions. So they're basically space operas in disguise, and in some ways quite weird and questionable, but stories nonetheless. And then in terms of film, I actually haven't seen much of The Expanse or of For All Mankind or obviously Total Recall. I'm a bad person, but I absolutely love Ridley Scott's adaptation of The Martian. It's a beautiful, beautiful movie. Absolutely extraordinary. Like in terms of, again, like technical accuracy, there's goofs all over the place. So for example, like the planet is rotating in the wrong direction in the opening shot. But you can kind of look past that and just appreciate it for what it is. It's just an extraordinary film.
I mean, it's funny. I mean, because you're thinking about some of these things so much that in some way you'd be like the perfect hard science fiction writer. Have you ever been tempted by writing fiction? Yeah,
I mean, I've got a few. Essentially all the short stories I've written as an adult, I've published on my blog, so you can dig through and find them. I did a science fiction writing course in 2016 where I wrote a couple of different books. Wrote a couple of short stories. It's fun. It's fun to write, but at a certain point in life, you realize where your strengths lie. I've certainly greatly enjoyed the privilege of helping some friends with the composition of their novels. So, for example, like they give me a call and say, hi, I need this person to jump off the moon. How much delta V do they need or something? And I can give them a number and they can put it in. And then, that forestalls 4,000 angry nerds writing them letters and emails over the next 10 years. And that's actually, it's a real privilege to be kind of part of that process. But anyway, I don't know. I've got a few ideas lurking. I've got a concept lurking in the back of my mind for a book about immortality, actually. But it's
I'm looking forward to that one. Yeah.
I don't know. Like, and then someone asked me like, how many tabs do you have open on your computer? Or like, what are your tabs? And I was like, oh God, like maybe 1,000. Something like almost all of them represent orphan writing projects. So it's a bit dismal.
I think I'm currently have about 300 open, which is the main reason I need like computer technology to advance. But jokes aside, speaking of writing, so within your blog, any sort of future articles you want to tease that are in your mind?
Okay, well, so I have a side-by-side review, Kim Stanley Robinson and Neil Stephenson's climate books, Termination Shock and Ministry of the Future. So I read both those books, and I'm actually acknowledged in Ministry of the Future. So spoiler alert, but it's fascinating to me because I've met Neil and Stan once or twice, and I know that they don't routinely read each other's work, and actually they see themselves as like from different literary traditions. So like Neil's more from like the cyberpunk tradition, and Stan is more from like the I don't know, like PK Dick, like kind of literary sci-fi tradition. But it's quite clear if you read the various books that published over the last 20 years that they often draw from the same sources. And actually there's this kind of incredible convergence in these two novels about the climate stuff, even though they're completely different stories set in different worlds. Multiple plot beats and characters and formations and so on, quite similar, like almost embarrassingly so. And so I'm really looking forward to writing that. I don't know. I'll have to look at my list of potential future blogs. It's like
that's a good one. And I must say I've read The Ministry of the Future, which by the way I recommend to everyone. I think it's a very interesting book. I haven't read Neil's book, so
okay,
I should read it as well.
I wrote the desal blog recently, Starship layout efficiency trap. I kind of have some ideas here that they're not fully formed. They're basically like one-liners, like half a tweet length descriptions. And at some point, like the missing piece will fall into place, and then I'll sit down and bang out 5,000 words and call it done. But yeah. Anyway, if people have
We're
suggestions,
very much looking forward to that.
If people know what I should call my
the
blog,
same-
it's needed a name for like 10 years. So
I think people are used to Casey Handmer's blog now. But Casey, we're really looking forward to you continuing to do this. I think a lot of people love your blog posts and just find them very educational and informative. And so thank you very much for doing this. Thank you very much for being on this podcast, and hopefully we can do this again sometime in like a year or two.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and sorry to be a little bit inarticulate this morning. It's obviously I didn't sleep that well last night, but it's been fun, and yeah, thanks for having me.
And that's a wrap for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. Once more, if you enjoyed this, please leave us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platforms such as Apple or Spotify. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. You can support us at www.patreon.com/Space Business Podcast. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may include yourself if you have an interesting space story to tell, or interested in being a sponsor, drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. See you for the next episode.